This is Church and State with Stephen Kokx.
Thank you for listening to Magnificat Radio. This is Stephen Kokx. I'm your host of Church and State. Again, a show where we discuss all things Catholicism, all things politics, and everything in between.
God bless the great state of Iowa. Let me first of all say, to God be the glory. Iowa has sent notice that the Republican nominee and the next President of the United States will not be chosen by the media. Will not be chosen by the Washington establishment. Will not be chosen by the lobbyists. But will be chosen by the most incredible, powerful force where all sovereignty resides in our nation, by we, the people, the American people.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, is how the Iowa Caucus has turned out this week, Monday. And it is the first time, as you heard there, Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, that a Hispanic American has ever won a major caucus for one of the two parties. And yet, even though that is the case, the media paid next to no attention to that fact and highlighted nothing about that. But Iowa did go to Ted Cruz. I predicted a Cruz victory here last time on Church and State. Overall, he got about 26% of the Iowa caucuses, and that gives him 8 delegates towards the long march until the convention. But Donald Trump, the businessman from New York, came in a very, not just disappointing, but disastrous second place. Expectations were so high for him. All the polls had him in the lead, as he reminded folks day in and day out for the past several months. He came in almost third place, almost a percent away from coming in third place. He had about 24% of the overall vote, far behind anywhere he was expected or assuming he was going to land, as well as Marco Rubio had a strong and very surprising third place finish, right there with around 24% as well. And I think at the beginning or at the outset here, we're seeing a narrowing. I think that is generally the case. I think it's down to obviously Cruz and Trump. If Cruz did not win Iowa, I think his campaign would have a very much more difficult effort to go against Donald Trump. Obviously, Trump's in it. He has the polls still, and we'll talk about what all that means later on. But obviously, it seems that Rubio is taking the establishment lane. He might not be, as some conservatives have pointed out, an establishment candidate. He is conservative on certain issues, but he is filling that lane where typically the establishment candidate comes from. But welcome to Church and State, everybody. This is Stephen Kokx, your host on Magnificat Radio, again, where we discuss all things Catholicism, all things politics, and everything in between. Again, a lot to get to today, ladies and gentlemen. We want to talk about politics first. Later, we'll talk about, is it our Catholic duty to vote in these elections? Who should we be voting for? Which principles should we be relying on when it comes to voting? We'll get into all of that a little bit later, but this first segment, and we want to talk about what happened in Iowa. Okay, and over the weekend, it was the Rubio push, you could say. Now, I watched it from, again, the sidelines. I watched the media coming on Saturday and Sunday. Everyone was talking about how Rubio's got this late surge. Typically, my assumption was, well, this is the media just desiring for a candidate to rally behind. They want an establishment person to, talk up over the weekend. But it looks like it was real. And that in the end, at the end of the day, Rubio had overperformed, Trump underperformed. And so why was that the case? How did Trump lose after being ahead in the polls for so long? How did Cruz win? And how did Marco Rubio come in a strong third? Well, obviously, I think the decision by Donald Trump and his campaign to skip the Fox News debate just days before the Iowa caucuses, was a huge mistake. Okay, again, it opened him up to 3 points of criticism. One, by not being there, people then were allowed to say, well, if he can't answer questions from these debate moderators, if he's scared of them, how can he ever take on terrorism? Or how can he fight the real problems across the globe? Two, a lot of Iowa voters, I think, felt that the Donald was skipping out on them. Again, this was a debate held in Iowa, and they wanted to see him there. The Iowans are very, they want that to happen with their politics. They want to see their candidates. And Trump did not give that to them, at least on the debate stage. And then lastly, the debate, by him not being there, allowed voters and viewers to look and see, well, who else is out here? Who's Rubio? Who's Cruz? Jeb Bush had even a really good night, at least in the debate stage. But how else did the Donald lose? Well, obviously, the evangelical vote turned out. But they turned out for Ted Cruz. 180,000 Iowans turned out for the Republican caucuses. And that's a record. That's the most there's ever been in an Iowa caucus. Previously, the record was in 2012. And that was 150,000 Iowans. This time it was 180. And of those people who turned out, of the 180,000 that turned out, evangelicals made up 64% of them. And that's a big electorate, and that's a huge chunk of the voters. And Cruz won 34% of them, whereas Trump and Rubio each split about 22%. And obviously Trump has a problem with that. Iowa isn't built for him. The state really is built for Cruz. I mean, when you look at it, it's an evangelical state. For Trump, he had some issues trying to explain his faith. He got the endorsement of Jerry Falwell Jr. He went to Liberty University, stumbled with quoting scripture. He said 2 Corinthians. He didn't really know what he was kind of getting at. He says he's a Presbyterian, but the fact is that religion is a difficult thing for Trump to talk about and explain, and I think obviously voters picked up on that. And of those groups that Trump won, 31%, he won the first time caucus scores, he won 31% of them. Those whose immigration was the first issue, the biggest issue, he won about half of them. And 70% of voters who said they voted for him because they tell it like it is, because he tells it like it is, 70%. And so those are the reasons people like Trump. He's exciting, he's getting them riled up, he's fighting the establishment, he's big on immigration, okay? And these people largely decided their minds several months ago, okay? As far as Cruz, well, Cruz won the very conservative vote. 43% of folks who said they are very conservative went to Cruz. Again, about 34% of people who say they're evangelical voted for Donald Trump or voted for Ted Cruz. And 37% said people that Cruz shares their values. Now again, 30%, 40%, this might not seem big, but in a race of like 9 people, these are quite substantial numbers. And it was a very tactically wise decision, I think, by Ted Cruz to lump Donald Trump into this whole New York values thing. At the debate several weeks ago, Cruz attacked Donald Trump for saying, look, he's got New York values. He's not really one of the folks. He's an elitist, again, on the East Coast. He doesn't share, what we believe in. And at the debate stage, Trump had a great response to that. Because obviously he said, well, look, what do you mean New York values? What about 9/11? We all came together. But at the same time, the Cruz campaign was running a very effective ad, I thought, against Donald Trump, where in previous years, in previous interviews, a couple years ago on Meet the Press, it's a show on MSNBC, Donald Trump had come out saying what he believes in it. And well, take a listen. This is an ad that the Cruz campaign ran.
I mean, hey, I lived in New York City and Manhattan all my life, okay? So, my views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa.
They are different, like on abortion.
Would President Trump ban partial birth abortion?
Well, look, I am pro-choice in every respect.
And what does Trump think about Iowa?
How stupid are the people of Iowa?
Donald Trump, New York values, not ours.
My views are a little bit different than if I lived in Iowa.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
And so again, about 40% of people who voted for Cruz said he shares their values. And that's a big sticking point. And that's huge. So, but going forward again, how did really, Trump lose this? Well, again, Trump did best amongst moderate voters. But again, that's a very small amount of the Iowa caucus going constituency. They're only about 15% of the voters that were out there. Again, it was more likely the case. Again, Trump did not have a strong ground game. He did not have a strong presence on the ground, whereas Cruz had, I think, like 12,000 volunteers who were volunteering for him, knocking on doors, making phone calls, okay, getting the vote out. Okay, and Trump did not have that. He only had one state elected official in the state of Iowa endorse him, whereas Cruz had a couple congressmen. Steve King is 100% pro-life congressman. He endorsed Ted Cruz. Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, pretty staunch conservative. He won his endorsement. And what happened is, I think, again, Trump, he was relying on free media, free press, not a lot of mobility on the ground. He couldn't offset the advantages that Cruz had in terms of conservatives and those who showed up. And I think one has to wonder, he got the endorsement of Sarah Palin, but is Palin that relevant anymore? Is her voice, maybe is she going to harm him? I don't think he'll have her stump with her anymore. She won't be in New Hampshire with him, and she might show up in the future, but I think it would be smart if Donald Trump just said, thanks but no thanks. She's not as relevant as she once was. So in total, again, Cruz wins by getting out the very conservative vote, having a massive ground game, getting some pretty key endorsements in that state, and again, I think discrediting Trump with some of these ads. And it was a mistake, a huge mistake, to not go on that debate stage. And when the people turned out to vote, they voted not for him, and that's going to be that was a dent in his armor. He's not as invincible as he was, or as he said he was, and as some Trump voters said that he was either. And some of them were saying, it doesn't matter, he didn't win. These people in New Hampshire are getting interviewed and being asked, does it matter? Obviously it matters. It's a huge thing because it gives life and vitality and validity to the Cruz campaign, who's his biggest rival now and who stands, I think, to, in the long run, will overtake him. And obviously will also, I think, overtake, by the way, the voters of Ben Carson and Rand Paul. Rand Paul was the closest to Cruz's foreign policy as any other candidate. And obviously Paul is the libertarian-leaning Republican senator from Kentucky. And Cruz is going to reach out to them in the near future. He has to. That is a sort of natural constituency for him. If he can speak about the 10th Amendment, if he can talk about foreign policy, if he can get Rand Paul's endorsement in some way by speaking about liberty, a lot, just invoking that, that's huge. And the same thing goes for Carson's voters. Again, Carson's voters voted for him because of his social values, because of his religious values. It's necessary for Cruz to continue on getting that vote and to take that away from Rubio, because Rubio, he's a very skilled politician. He in the past couple of days, or the days leading up to the caucuses themselves, he had a number of ads that were put out on YouTube and stuff that were in regards to his religion and his social values, and he needs to keep pushing them because Cruz is going to go right after it. That's a big thing for Rubio. But we'll take a quick break. There's still much more I want to talk about with all of this. We're going to look at, how did Rubio actually come in third? Where do we go from here? What to expect in New Hampshire? There's a lot more to discuss. Who are the real losers? Who are the real winners? We'll be right back after this on Church and State on Magnificat Radio.
Magnificat Radio is available locally anywhere you are, through the internet, worldwide. If this is important to you, to have Magnificat Radio available in your life, then your tax-deductible contribution will help sustain it and keep Magnificat Media, Magnificat Radio going. Thank you for listening to and supporting Magnificat Radio.
Serving the faithful of the one, holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church.
We must try to live a Catholic life every day of our life, every hour of our life.
Living our traditional Catholic faith. This is Magnificat Radio and MagnificatMedia.com.
Thanks for sticking with us. This is Church and State on Magnificat Radio, and we're talking about what happened in Iowa this past week. What can we understand about these races? Who, really comes away a victor here? We were talking about earlier how Cruz won. He got out the evangelical vote. He had a great volunteer corps there in the state of Iowa. 12,000 supporters there, volunteers knocking on doors. Trump did not get go to the debate. He did not get many endorsements. He did not, like Ted Cruz, go to every county in the state. Trump has not spent too much money. And that led an opening for obviously the third candidate in this race now, I think, Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, and who is, I think, being hailed by many as the inevitable sort of establishment candidate. Now, the establishment is not rallying around him yet. They're pretty reticent to do so, in fact. I mean, their guy is still Jeb Bush, but there's still some other people out there, Chris Christie, and John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, who, by the way, just got the endorsement of the New York Times. The liberal New York Times. That is, it's a kiss of death for anyone in the Republican primary. You do not want the endorsement of the New York Times. But John Kasich got that. He's been endorsed in the state of New Hampshire by, I think, like 7 newspapers. He's running very well there, but he's one of these Republicans who wants to call a truce on social issues, just focus on economics, and he's one of these, I think, rhinos, Republicans in name only. But as far as Rubio goes, we did see over the weekend a big push by the media establishment saying, well, Rubio's coming on strong. I had doubted it. It's very common for folks in the media, especially a lot of the pundit class, especially the ones from inside the D.C. Beltway, to desire someone who's more of a moderate. We got this in John McCain. We got this in Mitt Romney and Bob Dole. Okay, and Rubio is, I think, again, he came on with the Tea Party in 2010. He was billed as a conservative then. There's been some issues, or at least some issues on immigration, according to some conservatives. Look, he was smart on election night to be the first candidate to give his speech, and he basically declared victory. And I think that was smart and wise by his press campaign also, after that speech, to get right out on the media outlets and say, hey, look, this is a 3-person race, because again, it shores up into voters' minds that, hey, look, it is. Why support someone else who got 10%, 12% there? And it was genius of them to leak the Tim Scott and Trey Gowdy endorsements on the same night. Tim Scott, for folks who don't know, is a United States Senator from South Carolina, and Trey Gowdy is a congressman from South Carolina, and that race comes up after the New Hampshire primaries, which are coming up right next week Tuesday. And so this all gives the illusion that Rubio is on a roll. He overperformed there. He has endorsements coming out, and that's a very smart thing. Again, is Rubio the establishment guy? We're going to have to wait and see until after New Hampshire. I mean, we can't make this suggestion yet. He is first in that establishment lane, because again, I don't think there's 4 lanes in this Republican race. There is the populist element, which is all Donald Trump. There's the Cruz way, who's showing that there is a conservative grassroots way to win this campaign. He did it with endorsements from Glenn Beck. He did it with endorsements from Mark Levin, these radio conservative guys. He did it with endorsements from conservative radio talk personalities in the state of Iowa who went out and campaigned and caucused for him. And that's why you heard in Cruz's victory speech at the beginning of this program him say, look, the media did not choose this victory, obviously an allusion to Donald Trump. The establishment did not choose this, obviously an allusion to Marco Rubio. But it was rather the grassroots who did the victory. And it seems that Trump, or Cruz rather, is confident that he can keep getting those people out. And I think we'll see where this goes. I do think South Carolina is very much suited for him, as well as Nevada. And I think he's a better tactician politically, obviously, than Donald Trump by light years. And I think over the long run, as Trump gets more erratic, his lack of discipline will get the best of him. And I think, generally speaking, the ground game and the campaign that Cruz has will eclipse that anger that Trump voters have, and they're going to naturally kind of migrate towards him. The risk, however, with Cruz has always been that he's perceived to be inauthentic, that he's perhaps too conservative, he's too wild-eyed, but there's been some commentary on him recently. John Zmirak has an essay, and somebody else, I forget who it is, someone in Texas wrote an essay saying, hey, look, he's just a constitutionalist. He's big on the 10th Amendment. He wants state sovereignty. He wants to follow the Constitution. He wants to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. And he comes off as a little well-rehearsed. And I think that is his risk. Is he a factional candidate? Is he only going to appeal to conservatives? I mean, at this point, the Republicans, I think, historically, they've run these moderates. And so maybe it's time for the conservatives to run someone who is a little bit hardline, and at least is perceived that way. So then we can finally decide, is America a center-right country, or is it a center-left and an evolving progressive country? Because that would be the matchup with someone like a Cruz and a Hillary. And even, I think you could say, even with a Marco Rubio and a Hillary. Because, again, they're different generations, and on a certain level, completely different views of human nature, the role of the state, and those are completely different politics. But, after this race, we did see a number of other candidates drop out. I've already mentioned Rand Paul. Rand Paul, again, was a libertarian, sort of conservative out of Kentucky. His support naturally goes to Cruz. If Cruz can get that 5 or 6 or 7% of the Republican electorate, that's going to be huge for him. If he can get the Carson voters, again, I think Carson's going to drop out soon. It's inevitable. He doesn't have the support at the top. He doesn't have the key advisors. People are leaving him. Again, if Cruz can take those two groups, those two segments of the Republican voters, that's going to be massive, and that's going to chip away, I think, at to an extent, obviously Rubio and the establishment, but also Trump in the long run. But I think we're seeing also, Trump can't, as Jeb Bush once said, insult his way to the presidency. He needs organization. He needs boots on the ground. He needs a more effective strategy. And one thing, I was on Twitter this week, I said Trump, if he wants to get back in control of all this, hey, just announce, right away who his vice president's going to be. And that's going to send shockwaves throughout the political class. And that would be one way to stay ahead of and remain atop of all the news that's coming out about the potential demise of his candidacy if he doesn't perform well in these next upcoming states. But so where do we go from here? Who's going to win New Hampshire? Who is going to be the other supporters going forward? Well, what needs to happen? What's going to happen in New Hampshire? I do predict that next week, Tuesday, that Trump will win that state. I think it's a state better suited, obviously, for him than Cruz. I don't see Cruz, at least at this point. The polls have him around 12, 13%. I don't know if I want to make a prediction. I think it's still a little volatile. But I do think that, look, if Cruz gets top 3, that would vindicate a lot of the momentum he's having. It would, again, and if he can get some of those Rand Paul supporters and maybe take away from Ben Carson, that would be good. But again, there's just not a lot of those people in New Hampshire, so it's going to be tough for Cruz to have an increase there. I think he has a bit of a ceiling. Rubio, look, if he can get second, that would be, again, going into this claim, I think it is the case where he would be building more momentum. I think if that's the case, you're going to see a lot of former Bush backers and Christie backers go his way. They're just going to say, look, we got to take on Trump, we got to take on Cruz, we need someone. And they're going to want to drag Rubio over to the establishment side and make him more of a moderate, make him more in the image and likeness of Jeb Bush. I don't know if Rubio can resist that. And already some of his advisors were former advisors to George Bush. And so he's almost going to be, he's going to have the same foreign policy. He's going to have a lot of the other same policies as well. So, but if Rubio doesn't win first or second, as long as he beats out the other establishment candidates, if he beats out Kasich, who again has, I think, 7 newspaper endorsements in the state, if he can beat out Christie and Bush, then I think he is going to be that so-called establishment lane candidate. And that's going to, force basically folks like Christie and Bush, I would think, pretty much out of the race. Bush got 6% in the Iowa caucuses. He spent, $60 million? Christie, he needs a win. If he doesn't do well, if he doesn't get top 2 in New Hampshire, I think he's probably much done. And you heard him this week call out Marco Rubio. He said, look, let's get Rubio in front of the press. He said he called him a bubble boy. And here's actually what he said. Here's Christie's remarks on Rubio.
You know me, unlike some of these other campaigns, I'm not the boy in the bubble, okay? We know who the boy in the bubble is up here, who never answers your questions, who's constantly scripted and controlled because he can't answer your questions. So when Senator Rubio gets here, when the boy in the bubble gets here, I hope you guys ask him some questions because it's time for him to start answering questions. He wants to say this race is over, and it's all him. It seems to me that he should have to sit across from you and answer your questions the way I do.
So it is do or die time for Chris Christie, for Jeb Bush, and for John Kasich, who completely skipped the Iowa caucuses. And because, well, naturally it doesn't fit him. It's not a state built for him. But if anything like that doesn't happen, if that happens, it is, I think, a 3-person race. Because then you go to South Carolina, and that's Cruz and Trump territory, and possibly Rubio with these big major endorsements. I mean, Lindsey Graham endorsed Jeb Bush, but again, that doesn't mean much. Polls in that state are showing him to not have much support. Again, I think what might happen or what needs to happen for these guys, South Carolina, Nevada, the states that are coming up, if Christie, Bush, or Kasich beat Rubio, those are still tough states for them. And for them to get momentum, I mean, they're going to have to stay in this till Super Tuesday, which is still several weeks away. And, I mean, it's going to be very difficult for any of those guys right now. Because, again, the conservative vote is going to Cruz. The anti-establishment, the populist vote is going to Trump. And that vote together is almost 50-60% of the Republican electorate. These establishment guys, they have no chance this election. They have no chance. And the only one who I think can really challenge Rubio is Christie. Bush, no one wants Bush this time. He's not going to get it. So it's smart, I think, again, for Cruz, he's got to appeal to these Rand Paul supporters, these libertarians. He's got to get the Carson vote. He's got to go after those conservatives even more so and paint at the debate Carson as someone who's out of touch, who can't govern, who's not experienced enough. And I think we'll see, again, a coalescence behind a lot of these candidates. Again, I think it's incumbent upon Cruz at the debate to, again, speak of the 10th Amendment, speak about a smarter foreign policy, praise Rand Paul as much as he can. He needs those voters. And Trump, he needs to keep, going and saying, hey, look, we're going to keep winning. He needs to not dwell on Iowa. There was reports this week where he said Cruz stole Iowa. No one stole Iowa. This is backwards looking. It's petty. And I think what we need to realize at the end of the day in all of this is something that Pat Buchanan wrote about in a recent column for the American Conservative. And basically what Buchanan argues is that, look, on both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats, there is anger and frustration with the policies of the elites, with the policies that both parties have been putting forth for the better part of the past 20 years. On the right, Buchanan says it's immigration, it's populism, it's patriotism, it's defying political correctness. And on the left, it's anti-interventionism, anti-nation building. He says we need less global policies, we need more pro-labor unions, less NAFTA. Buchanan is right. In the people we're seeing win a large percent of the vote in both parties. Again, Cruz and Trump, who would predict that these guys together have a stranglehold on almost 60% of the Republican electorate? And who would predict that Bernie Sanders, the sort of curmudgeon-y, 74-year-old socialist, almost beat Hillary Clinton in the Iowa caucuses? There is a reality that both parties need to take stock of. And whoever the candidate is, as Buchanan says, we're at the beginning of a new era and a close of another. Because going forward, these policies, building a wall, anti-immigration, opposed to multiculturalism, opposed to these endless wars, pro-middle-class, blue-collar Americans, that is real. And middle America, as well as young people, want that. And from here on out, whoever the nominees of the parties are going to be, they need to take stock of that. We'll be right back with more Church and State on Magnificat Radio.
Magnificat Radio is available locally anywhere you are, through the internet, worldwide. If this is important to you, to have Magnificat Radio available in your life, then your tax-deductible contribution will help sustain it and keep Magnificat Media, Magnificat Radio going. Thank you for listening to and supporting Magnificat Radio.
Thank you for listening to Magnificat Radio. This is Stephen Kokx. I'm your host of Church and State. Again, a show where we discuss all things Catholicism, all things politics, and everything in between. I'm often asked, why are you so interested in politics? Why should Catholics be concerned with what's going on in the, not just the Republican and Democratic Party, those are just the two major parties, but in politics in general? And I had the honor of speaking with Sam Guzman, the purveyor of the Catholic Gentleman. It's a very well-known website and popular Facebook page recently. And we discussed this very topic. So why does it matter? Why should we be involved? To what extent should we care about any of this? After all, isn't politics just like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Isn't it just like quicksand? We're going to reach the bottom inevitably. Go on my Church and State's Facebook page, and you can watch what I said about all those questions there with Sam. It's a live interview that we did on YouTube, and that was a lot of fun to do, and I recommend you go and become a fan of the Catholic Gentleman website, because it's a great resource in these times when we need to protect our faith as best we can, and there's a lot of really good and a lot of well-articulated opinions and views that Sam puts out, and so do become a fan of his as best you can. But I wanted to get into this issue of voting and explain, hopefully, just some principles as to how Catholics should be thinking about elections, about voting, about their duty in a state such as the United States, where, again, I do think it is very much, in our day and age, nothing more than unaided human reason, just raw intellect and raw reason trying to figure out problems which can only be solved by supernatural means. And until we figure out those supernatural means, rather, we know what they are, but until we put them into practice, we're not going to solve the issues and problems anytime soon. So let's cover this first issue. Is it an obligation for us to vote? Should we vote? Do we have to vote? It's not very fun to vote for the lesser of two evils. What should we do? Okay. Obviously, voting today, it's always a case of people say, oh, you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. The right to vote is something you need to do. It is, according to Pope Pius XII in 1946, this is taken from an article written in 2007 by Father Peter Scott in The Angelus magazine. He's quoting Pope Pius XII in 1946, and this is what Pope Pius says. The people are called to take an always larger part in the public life of the nation. This participation brings with it grave responsibilities. Hence the need for the faithful to have clear, solid, precise knowledge of their duties. Okay? So pretty simple, right? We have a duty as persons who are trying to build up the kingdom of God, who understand that Christ has a right to be recognized in public by his creatures, and whose creatures do not have a right to go against his will. And so therefore we must help permeate and institute in laws amongst nations the will of God and the laws of God. We don't, as Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre once said, have a right to be governed by atheists, by socialists, by communists, by those who reject the will and law of God. Again, the public sphere belongs to God. He is a jealous God. It belongs to him. Pluralism is not objectively pleasing. Now, Pius XII, in Father Peter Scott's article, is also quoted again in 1946, in March of that year. And here's what he says. The exercise of the right to vote is an act of grave moral responsibility, at least with respect to electing those who are called to give to a country its constitution and its laws, and in particular laws that influence holy days of obligation, marriage, etc. So again, just reiterating this point that we do, that voting is a very grave thing. When we put persons into office, you are complicit to an extent, in a formal or material manner, with what happens. Okay, and we'll explain that more in just a second. Pius XII goes on to say, look, it is the obligation for those who have the right to vote to take part in elections, and who abstains from doing so commits a grave sin, a mortal fault. But again, this goes back to the idea that, well, we are actually in a state, in a country, in a nation where everything's pretty much even-keeled, okay? And obviously in the United States, this is not the case. Several weeks ago, Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States, said we live in an oligarchy. And I agree. Thanks to conservative justices on the Supreme Court and the Citizens United court case ruling, corporations are able to spend unlimited amounts of money under the guise of quote-unquote free speech to influence elections. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, there is no position in the United States, or I would even argue the Western Hemisphere, Western civilization, that cannot be manufactured by a slick media campaign, years, if not decades, of assimilation and a slow chipping away at certain values. And I think that's evident, obviously, in the idea of sodomy as a form of marriage. And I think we're going to see that also in the idea of transgenderism. There is literally no political position that cannot be manufactured by the American media complex. We live in times where our means of communication and entertainment and culture and news can very much persuade those who listen to it. And so that reality is what compelled Father Peter Scott in this article in 2007 for The Angelus on voting to say, quote, how far we are removed from the situation that Pope Pius XII speaks of. And Father Peter Scott goes on to say, clearly we are no longer in the circumstances of having to choose between a Catholic and non-Catholic, morally upright and liberal representatives. All the alternatives, Father Scott says, are liberal, and the deception and manipulation of the public by the media is rampant. And now he says, Father, this is the crux of the matter, usually it comes down to voting for the lesser of two evils. He says, is it permissible to vote for an unworthy candidate? For he would at least be the lesser of two evils, we suppose, again. In such a case, Father Peter Scott says, there can be no obligation to vote. It is still permissible to vote in such a case, provided that one can be sure that there truly is a lesser evil, and that there is a grave reason to do so. But doing this is still material cooperation with the evil that comes. So a lot of folks out there say, okay, well, who do you support, Steve? Who are you endorsing this time around? We need to think on principle here. This material cooperation, which again means nothing more than cooperating with evil, but without desiring or consenting of the action or evil that really comes about. In other words, desiring the goodness of it. Okay, that is material cooperation, whereas a formal cooperation would be to actively will the evil that would come about from an act. So I think it's obviously the case that if you're voting for a Democratic candidate who's pretty much every Democrat out there is pro-abortion, you're formally committing and endorsing and willfully participating in the evil that will come about from that. And when you vote for them for that reason. To clarify the issue of abortion and why it is the gravest of all crimes, some people say, well, abortion is just one issue of life. Democrats stand up for the poor and the unemployed. Republicans go to war. They fight unjust wars. Democrats at least look out for the middle class, labor unions, people's rights, food stamps. Well, those are material things. Those are things of this world. Life is much more than that. We cannot take with us food stamps, labor union rights, wages with us into the next world. Those are things of this earth. And as we know, the Democratic Party is focused on homosexuality and transgenderism. Therefore, it is all about enjoying this earth as much as possible and as much freedom, quote unquote, and rather licentiousness, is their party platform. And so, what we can say then, as Father Peter Scott says, in the rare case that there are informed Catholic candidates who publicly support the teaching of the Church, there is a strict moral obligation to vote under pain of mortal sin for them. Okay? Where there is a clear gain possible from the correct use of a vote for some candidate, it can be recommended. However, he says, when there is no clear advantage, it would be better to abstain, so as not to even contribute in a material participation. So again, in the rare case, Father Scott says, where there are informed Catholic candidates who publicly support the Church's teachings, there is a strict moral obligation to vote under pain of mortal sin. Second, when there is a clear gain possible from the correct use of a vote for some other candidate, it can be recommended or counseled to do so. And third, Father Scott says, when there is no clear advantage, it would be better to abstain so as not to contribute even to a material participation. And that is something Catholics need to think about. Is there a real clear advantage for voting at the national level for certain candidates on the Republican side that would actually make an improvement in the common good? Or are we at a point where we should be voting third party if we're going to vote at all? Or should we just simply not vote when faced with the lesser of two evils? Because it seems that there really is no clear advantage that would happen by preferring a Republican to a Democrat or a Democrat to a Republican. I'll answer these questions when we come back from this break. You're listening to Church and State on Magnificat Radio.
Man, there is nothing like that first cup of coffee. And when it's Abbey Roast from Our Lady of Guadalupe Monastery, well, then there's nothing like a second or third cup, no matter what time of day. You see, the Benedictine monks of Our Lady of Guadalupe Monastery carefully and prayerfully roast 100% gourmet Arabica beans in small, hand-scooped batches in order to bring out the unique qualities of the best selected beans, direct trade from a small family plantation high in the mountains of Brazil. Go ahead, have another cup of Abbey Roast from Our Lady of Guadalupe Monastery. Order direct at abbeyroast.com. Carefully and prayerfully roasted beans from Our Lady of Guadalupe Monastery, abbeyroast.com.
Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. Central Time. It's your morning tradition with Mike and Lisa here on Magnificat Radio at magnificatmedia.com.
Thank you for listening to Magnificat Radio. This is Stephen Kokx. I'm your host of Church and State. Again, a show where we discuss all things Catholicism, all things politics, and everything in between. So we left off last segment discussing material and formal cooperation with evil, the principle that Father Peter Scott laid out in an article in the Angelus several years ago on voting, and in the fact that when there is no clear advantage to voting, we do not need to, or be better perhaps, to abstain from voting, so to avoid material and formal cooperation with evil. And before we revisit that, I want to mention, obviously, as Father Peter Scott says in another issue of the Angelus, the reason we're involved in politics. We are involved in politics in the temporal sphere to direct the temporal sphere to the social kingdom of Christ, to build up the kingdom of heaven on earth. For again, civil society belongs to God, belongs to Christ. It needs to be permeated with the supernatural principles, with the Ten Commandments, with the rights to the true religion. And it is important to recognize this. And again, Father Peter Scott tells us it can be permissible to tolerate the lesser of two evils for a proportionate reason, and such toleration can be for the common good, precisely because it is the lesser of two evils. Therefore, it is possible to vote or even campaign for a candidate whose platform contains some evils which we do not agree. But he says, and here's the caveat, it depends on a hierarchy. Again, I mentioned this in the last segment. For a Catholic, Father Scott says, there can be no doubt that the issues that take the highest priority, must be the moral issues, and not personal or economic issues. He says the whole continuation of society depends upon this. And those who deny the most basic principles of the natural order are bringing about an unheard of perversion, he says. In other words, what I had reiterated earlier, candidates who prescribe abortion, who allow and endorse and want to expand sodomy as a right, who push euthanasia, who want to attack the Catholic Church, these are policies that Catholics cannot endorse and cannot support, even in, quote, good conscience, as some Catholics today want to say, my conscience forces me to support them. No, these take moral precedent over the perceived, perhaps, improvement in the lives, quote unquote, of other issues. Again, if a man has the whole world, wins the whole world, but loses his soul, what is he? It's a complete waste. It doesn't matter. So therefore, Father Scott says, it would be permissible and prudent to vote for a candidate who promotes an unjust war on the basis that they are opposed to any of those other issues. He says, consequently, it is likewise permissible for a Catholic to vote for a Freemason if that person maintains important principles of the Catholic faith and of the natural law, such as the evil of abortion, if he's opposed to that. Now again, it does come down to the idea of supporting, well, can we support the lesser of two evils? Father Scott is pretty clear here. It says, when it seems to be the case that the common good can be supported, when the moral issues that we've mentioned are able to be supported, prudence dictates that it is possible, it is permissible to do that. But the difficult thing is to know whether or not that's a clear vote for the better candidate. And I think what folks like Steve Skojec have touched upon in their essay recently on 1 Peter 5 about abortion politics and about unjust wars in the Middle East, are we really voting for the lesser of two evils? I mean, abortion rates, they've gone down, but no thanks really to the elites of the Republican Party who want to call a truce on social issues. They want to get rid of social conservatives who stand up for the unborn children who are made in the image and likeness of God. They want to get rid of they want to purify the party from social conservatives, from folks who acknowledge the truth about marriage. They would rather we not exist, and they would rather we not be a part of their party. And I think you see that even in some of the candidates running for president. Their top issues are not against abortion. They're not wanting to fight the fight against sodomy or transgenderism. They're somewhat lukewarm. And more than that, as it happened in the early 2000s, the Republican Party, more even than the Democratic Party, is so eager to spread these Freemasonic principles across the globe in the Middle East, where they're willing to go to the extent of fighting all these unjust wars. And folks like Pat Buchanan, Father Juan Carlos Escarra from St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary, professors like Claes Ryan from Catholic University of America in the 2000s came out against these neoconservative policies of unjust wars. And moreover, it's the Republican Party whose endorsements of usury, economic liberalism, laissez-faire capitalism that promotes materialism, hedonism, and fights crusades for capitalism at the behest of nations like Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. We do their bidding. And moreover, that sort of economic policy increases the massive inequality of wealth going on in the world. I think it was just the other week. There were statistics that showed the world's top 80 or so, might have been 60, richest persons possess the same amount of wealth as the world's bottom 3.6 billion. 3.6 billion people have the same amount of wealth together as the world's top 80 persons, individuals. And yet, what do we hear from those in the Republican Party about this? More tax breaks, more offshoring, more globalization, expand the military. Taxation is theft. Government steals from the American people. Any sort of government assistance is socialism. And so we are in a bind, Catholics, I think at this point, it can be argued that choosing between the two parties is not necessarily a choice between the lesser of two evils. I think you can make the argument in a certain way that voting for either party is a cooperation with the liberal system that should be avoided. And there are some folks out there who have made this argument. I'll have a friend of mine on this show in the near future, Gabriel Sanchez. I want to talk about economics with him, but I think we might bring up this issue as well with him because he penned an article about a year and a half ago, maybe several years ago now. It was for The Bridge magazine. It's a news online outlet in West Michigan, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he said, I'm not voting because, well, the system is, again, entirely anti-Catholic. That doesn't mean I'm not going to be involved in local affairs and make sure that my voice is heard. But in totality, the alternatives that are given to us really aren't going to do anything other than adhere to the principles of liberalism. I'll ask Gabriel about that, and I'll also ask him about third parties, because there's a lot of folks, a lot of Catholics who say, look, we need to stand up on principle and vote for those parties who are most in alignment with, or rather most opposed to, this liberal monstrosity that we are living in. If you want to make the argument, and some folks have, that cooperating in this system, at least in regards to voting, because again, it is impossible to not live in this modernist liberal culture and make a living, breathe its air, go about your way of life. We're all in a certain way tainted with it, with its toxicity, and so we need to immunize ourselves with the Holy Catholic Church and Catholic tradition and the sacraments and the true Mass, which again was gifted to us by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who in a certain way essentially built up a Noah's Ark, built up and secured the passing on of the Catholic faith to us. So in that regard, you're going to find different Catholics use that rationale to say, well, people say, well, I'm going to vote for third party, so I'm not material and formally complicit in the liberal destruction that the two-party system has monopolized and is implementing and has a stranglehold around. I mean, I think that case can be made. It's not one I necessarily adhere to. I think some folks think it sends more of a message than it really does. I don't know if it's all that effective, but at the same time, it is perhaps better to not be at all, to not, as Father Scott said, to materially or formally be involved in this error. And so I know some Catholics who are, on the other hand, say, like Alistair McIntyre, the professor at Notre Dame, who says when forced with the lesser of two evils, just don't choose. There's other ways you can involve yourself in politics. And I'll look at those and have some final thoughts on voting and involvement in this American experiment right after this quick break for Church and State on Magnificat Radio.
Every Sunday evening, end your holy day with us here at approximately 6 p.m. for 45 minutes of prayer and chant as Magnificat Radio presents the Magnificat and the Holy Rosary, followed immediately with Sunday evening Vespers. This Sunday and every Sunday at approximately 6 p.m. Central Time, U.S., the Magnificat, the Holy Rosary, and Sunday Vespers. Here on Magnificat Radio at magnificatmedia.com, living our traditional Catholic faith.
So let's close out today's show, which has been focused all on politics, all on the state, in other words, with some closing thoughts. In last segment, I gave a rundown on the church's teachings as provided to us by Father Scott, Peter Scott, on involvement in politics and the system we have, as well as to why some believe it is perhaps best and prudent to not vote for either of the two major parties in this liberal system. Again, that is a position that can be argued, seeing how both parties themselves would probably wish nothing more than to do away with social conservatives. Obviously, there's one party that's more conducive to our arguments, but in totality, the dire situation we are met with, the fact that both parties have completely failed in their moral obligations to uphold even the natural law, the fact that it seems maybe even wise to vote third party. There's alternatives to this system, but I think in general, we've been focusing on voting itself. Voting and not voting, it's not the be-all, end-all. I mean, when you look at the presidential race, and when you look at congressional districts, they're drawn intentionally to favor certain political parties over the others. We call this gerrymandering. I mean, certain states go Democrat, certain states go Republican every time. Michigan, where I'm from, hasn't gone Democrat or hasn't gone Republican for 30-some years. There are congressional districts in the United States, almost, I think, 70% of our congressional districts in the United States House of Representatives, there's 435 in total, that are solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. Less than 100 seats in the House are toss-up seats. In other words, only a quarter of our districts, we don't know who's going to be Republican or Democrat. All the other districts are solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. So, on just a practical, natural matter, it's sometimes pointless to vote. And just voting more and more and more and trying to influence just a couple thousand people when the gap between, a pro-life candidate and someone who's pro-abortion is like 60,000. Hey, you're not going to solve it by just without other means. That's not at all to say it is not wise to dedicate time to political causes and to registering people to vote and to stand up for pro-life measures and get involved in your city, your state, again, anywhere. I'm not saying that. But at a certain point, in certain states, in certain races, in certain counties, in certain cities, again, the nuance has to be taken into account. And sometimes it is best to say, especially in our times, there's other ways you can influence the public sphere, but if you're dedicating your entire life to it, and you're forgetting to build up the treasures in heaven, and you're just focusing on the heresy of good works and going from left to right to up and down, you need to have a sense of proportion here. I think that's the trick sometimes that people get fooled into, is to just be always up to date and involved in everything going on in this American culture and civilization. It can be a sort of trick of the devil. As I said on my show with Sam Guzman, focus first, and the change we need is not going to happen at the ballot box. It needs to happen supernaturally. So focus first on yourself. You can't give what you don't have. Become the best Catholic you can. Fulfill the duty and say that you have. If you're a father, raise good children to be Catholics. If you're a teacher, teach good Catholic principles. If you're a priest, preach about the social kingship of Christ. Motivate your congregation to do that, to be martyrs for their faith, to unflinchingly preach the truth in season, out of season, and work in concentric circles. This is what Carol Robinson, the editor of Integrity magazine in the 1940s, which, by the way, everyone needs to read, her book called My Life with Thomas Aquinas, and I'll be reviewing that in the near future. Her advice is, well, look, society's dying. This is why the Blessed Mother is appearing to us. Not only to Juan Diego, not only Our Lady of Good Success, not only Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Akita, Our Lady of La Salette. When we pray the Hail Mary, we pray that our Blessed Mother come to us at the hour of our death. Carol Robinson's view, the 1940s of all years, this is almost 70 years ago, was that society is dying, and we need the supernatural to be infused into society. And that's exactly where the solution is going to happen. It's not, as she argues, a new United Nations program. It's not development goals. It's not sustainability. It's penance and prayer and doing what our Blessed Mother had asked. And that's praying the Rosary and asking for her intercession and for consecrating Russia. What needs to happen, at a local level at least, be involved in your council meetings where they're setting school board curriculums. And now they're overtaking it with this LGBTQ RS, so-called quote-unquote lesbian, gay, transgendered agenda. Be involved in that. Support and oppose those tax millages and local resolutions and amendments to your state constitutions as best you can. In particular, the ones that harm the family. Support the ones that help the family. Support the ones that help the common good and man's integral being, the entirety of the person, his spiritual as well as natural well-being. And if you are able to, run for office. You can't leave this up to others. Take back these parties from those elitists who would use them for evil. We do not have to vote. It is not obligatory to vote for lesser evil, but it may be prudent and it may be permissible. And if that's the case, then make sure you're doing everything you can that those who win elections not only implement the laws that are in alignment with the social kingship of Christ, but also that you hold them accountable. Just never forget the entire liberal system that the Democratic and Republican parties support is a diabolical system. We know the liberal system, liberalism itself, holds that the only truth that there is that there is no truth. But that's diabolical, because we know that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. We are in quicksand, and the only way out of it is to invoke the name and help of Jesus Christ, and to do our best with what we have, and to understand that when faced with these choices between evils, instead of just being the victims of it, be proactive and do the best you can to make sure the laws of Christ are established and permeated throughout society. And quit playing the victim card. We have the truth on our side, and we must hold those accountable, as the March for Life did the other week, and we must participate in Catholic action. I mean, Catholic action, and we'll talk about that in a future show, that is what we must be doing. And there's plenty of literature out there on it that was especially written in the late 1800s and early 1900s. What is it we should practically be doing in response to all this? I think I'll cover that in an episode in the very near future. But we have to be involved in politics and reproach error, and, like Christ, to expose the faults of the world, and to, like any good doctor, prescribe the remedy. And to put forth that truth be recognized publicly, socially, because there is no equivalent, there is no unity between truth in error, between justice and injustice, between Christ and Belial. They have committed a terrorist act upon the social kingship of Christ and are illegally occupying the public sphere. They have no right to be where they are. God has the rights, man has the duty to recognize that, and we will do that if we live out our Catholic principles the way in which Christ commanded us to. So thank you for sticking with us today on Church and State. I'm Stephen Kokx, your host. Again, reach me on email, skokx1@gmail.com. Send me any of your thoughts, concerns, questions. I will read them on air. Like us on Facebook, Church and State with Stephen Kokx. That's the page. Find me also on Twitter @Stephen Kokx. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Have a blessed rest of your day. Take care.
You're listening to Traditional Catholic Radio online at Magnificat Radio and MagnificatMedia.com. Thank you for listening and supporting Traditional Catholic Radio.